Welcome to Second Sec, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. The relationship between South Africa's infrastructure plans and possible industrial renewal came into focus this week when President Ramaphosa met with the metals and engineering industry. Terence Creamer joins me to discuss whether the R1 trillion program can stimulate manufacturing. Welcome, Terence.
Oh, certainly.
Now, industry is under pressure because of a lack of demand and from competition.
Yes, we've had a chronic lack of demand in this economy. I suppose the last time we saw any boom in demand was in the run-up to the FIFA 2010 World Cup. Since then, it's really been a deindustrialization story and a construction fall off the cliff. But it's really been a deindustrialization story in the sort of period of democracy, unfortunately. So we had about 21% of our gross domestic product rising from manufacturing in 1994, and currently it's sitting around 13%. So we've seen that this lack of demand has been a key issue for manufacturers. And then coupled with that, there's been aggressive import competition. And we have, since 1994, also liberalized massively our trade policy because a lot of our industries were built behind big tariff barriers and were uncompetitive. So the view at the time was to give them this positive shock and to get them competitive. But at the same time, we lost a lot of manufacturing capability. And we also tied ourselves in to World Trade Organization rules. So we can only really go up to a bound rate of protection, which is not very hard. It's not high as what it was in the past. So import competition, as there's been sort of a glut of certain products, particularly out of China, but not only China, that is now looking for markets. And our manufacturers and our downstream industry are feeling the brunt of that through a lot of imports, some of it fair, but some of it unfair.
Now, the competitiveness of input costs have also become a problem.
Yes, so South Africa, everyone's having inflationary sort of difficulty around the world. But South Africa's had two particular areas of input cost inflation that have been sort of outliers. The one has been in electricity. We know we've had these sort of double-digit tariff increases or above inflation tariff increases for over a 20-year period. And that came off a very low base, and our electricity prices weren't priced correctly. But at the same time, it's been a very steep rise in tariffs. And that's really put pressure on a lot of industries that were already built around those cheap electricity prices. And we see particularly the smelter industries basically collapse. We see a number of other electricity industry, intensive industries really struggling. Steel is not fully intensive, but it still relies a lot on electricity. And that industry is under a lot of pressure, and then other reasons why it's under pressure, but that's one of them. And there's other industries that are only really surviving because they've got a negotiated pricing agreement. The long-term deal that, say, the aluminium industry has allows it to survive. And now we've seen a couple of chrome producers that have now recently received a favorable negotiating pricing agreement, much more favorable than what they had, and that's helping them restart. But there's a whole lot of other ferroalloys producers that are right on the brink. And then the other big input cost pressure, and it hasn't only been about cost, it's about reliability of electricity supply. And similarly, on the other input cost pressure, which has been around freight logistics, we've seen a real collapse, or we saw a real collapse in the service of the railways and to extent the ports, and a rise in tariffs. So those two additional input costs over and above the general difficult inflationary environment has been difficult for South African manufacturers.
But the president sees the R1 trillion as a way to stimulate manufacturing.
Yeah, so we've got this promise of 1 trillion rands of investment across a range of infrastructure sectors, from water through to roads, through to building dams, through to the big electricity transmission rollouts, and then the freight and passenger rail sort of ambitions. But also there's this huge municipal backlog, so there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to pent up demand. There's a demand to fix infrastructure as well. And there's this 1 billion rand figure that's out there in public domain around public infrastructure. Now, there's a lot of obviously skepticism and reticence because we've seen these figures before and they haven't really delivered. But there seems to be a case this time where, well, in some ways, some of this just has to be spent because the backlog is so deep. And if it isn't spent, we're going to have a collapse of the economy and of services. So there is signs that some of this is starting to come through. And the president, he met with CIFSA this week and is basically saying this is an industrialization opportunity. You made particular reference to the grid investment. So we've got a big sort of 200 to 300 billion rand investment that's supposed to take place between now and the middle of next decade. So we've got up 14,500 kilometers of grid infrastructure, power lines, and then the grid infrastructure surrounding that. And that's seen as an industrialization opportunity. I think the view is that that target's becoming more and more difficult to meet because we've been so slow in actually ramping up. But still, you're going to be building a lot of grid and trying to leverage that to help renew the factories, get demand back onto the factory floor. That's an important thing, and that's not inevitable because there's definitely import competition on the horizon, but it is an opportunity. And then thinking of the energy transition. So saying we're going to be building a lot more wind and solar. There are a lot of components that go into there that we could produce locally, not all of them, but if we choose selectively, we could become a hub for Africa in supplying these components, well, into our own market and into the rest of the Africa, into the rest of the world. So that's the sort of thinking around the trillion rand and around the reform program as well.
So the view is that reforms could help accelerate investment and bring costs under control.
Yes. So the reform program, the president is being the champion of this, and it's cutting across. It started with electricity, and it was really about load shedding, but also about reshaping the electricity supply industry's architecture and making it fit for purpose. And he's been quite dogged in pushing ahead, saying we need to have this separation or unbundling of Eskom to level the playing field. It's going to be important for investment, to crowd in private sector participation because that 1 trillion rand is just the public sector. You need to have much more than that if we're going to fill our factory floors and get the order books going again. So having private sector participation in places like generation in the grid build out. So there's an RTP, independent transmission project program starting to emerge, which would be private investors into the grid, but into all these other infrastructure sectors, having these reforms that caters for private sector participation, which really means crowding in private capital into public services, whether it's freight logistics, whether it's passenger rail, whether it's obviously the electricity generation. That's going to be important. So he's tied that very much to our growth agenda and to getting this private money, private expertise, and private innovation into delivering this. So this is seen as a key part of the growth story. And he says he's in a hurry. And what he's sort of the signal that he sent around the Eskom unbundling and endorsing recently the restructuring plan there signals that he is indeed in a hurry.
Thanks for speaking with us, Terence.
Pleasure.
That's it for today. Join us again next week for more news analysis.